Wow, thank you, Amy. I'm not sure I'm going to live up to that, but it's very exciting to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to present to you today some work that looks at something that might be quite different to what you hear about in demography or epidemiology, that looks at how the theory of minority stress can be used to explain negative health behaviors, sexual risk-taking, and violence among men who have sex with men. This is work that was funded jointly by the NIMH and NICHD. It's work that comes to an end this month, and this is actually the first time I've presented the results. So you're the first people to hear the results of this study, so you're either going to love it or hate it. So I'm going to present to you today some work that looks at, using minority stress as a framework for understanding why an already vulnerable population may have more negative health behaviors. And before I start, I want to talk about the background to this. What got me started thinking about this? And as Amy said, I'm a demographer and an epidemiologist by training, and my background is in women's health. And I worked a lot in sexual reproductive health in Southern Eastern Africa and South Asia. And my work really centered around violence and the negative effects that violence has on women's health. And I got to thinking one day, well, there are all types of couples. What's the level of violence in a same-sex couple? Does it have the same negative impacts on health? More importantly, is violence the same in a same-sex couple? Is it conceptualized and perceived as being the same? And so I began to look in the research, and there's very little research out there. There was, I think at the time I started this, less than 10 papers published on intimate partner violence among same-sex couples, the majority of which focused on lesbian couples, or focused on hate crimes rather than intimate partner violence. And they all used the conflict tactic scale, a heterosexual definition of violence, maybe. So I started to look at, the existing evidence. And the existing evidence showed that around 25 to 50% of men who have sex with men, or gay bisexual men, report experiencing intimate partner violence, which is the same as heterosexual women. So if you look at the World Report on Violence, or last week CDC released a new report on violence, intimate partner violence in the US, and it's strikingly similar that the lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence among gay and bisexual men is identical to what's experienced by heterosexual women. But it's very different to what's experienced by heterosexual men. Heterosexual men report around a 3% prevalence of violence. Then there's a lot of, the reporting of violence is heavily tied up in gender scripts and normative behaviors, and the extent to which heterosexual men report violence versus experience it is open for debate. We also know that men who have sex with men are the largest risk group for HIV in the US. According to the last CDC estimates, they're the only risk group that's shown an increase in incidence since 2006. And the increase in incidence is much higher, particularly among young men, so men 13 to 24, and young men of color. So this is already a vulnerable minority group who's experiencing the highest burden of HIV. Interestingly, so the prevalence of HIV among men who have sex with men in the US ranges around 16 to 25%. The prevalence of HIV among MSM in downtown Atlanta is the same as Zambia. Just to put that in perspective, when we talk about HIV and we talk about large epidemics in Africa, we have local large epidemics as well. Majority of new infections occur within main partners, and this is counterintuitive. Well, not counterintuitive, but it's counter to everything the 30 years of HIV prevention have told us. HIV prevention messages were always about the dangers of casual sex. And, ABCs, the B is be faithful, find a partner. Well, modeling work by Sullivan from CDC showed that actually 2/3 of new infections come from main partners. It makes sense. You have more sex with your main partner, so there's more potential exposures. You're more likely to have penetrative sex, you're less likely to use condoms. So this led me to write a proposal to NIH to say, can we look at what is violence among gay and bisexual men and what explains why it occurs? And this became what we call Project Lust. It stands for Let Us Stand Together. I manage a large team that, when Amy was at Emory, she was a part of, and we had a competition to find the name, and this one was that or Project Chimp, which was healthy, intimate male partners, and we decided that lust was a better way to go. And so it's the comprehensive study of IPV among MSM. It's the largest study ever undertaken. We had a sample size of 1,100. To put this in perspective, prior to this, the largest sample size was 150 something that had ever been looked to look at IPV among MSM. All the data was collected in Atlanta, and we focused on minority stress as the correlate of IPV and sexual risk-taking. So in the study, we looked at what defines violence. We looked at measuring elements of minority stress. We looked at sexual risk-taking. We did not test for HIV. We only have self-reported HIV status. Before we undertook the survey, we did a series of 10 to 12 focus groups with MSM in Atlanta, where we got them to define what violence was. And we used the conflict tactics scale, which has 23 items, as our question guide. And we went through, is this violent? Is this violence? Under what circumstances is this considered violent? Interesting that gay and bisexual men in our focus groups did not think that a lot of the items on the conflict tactics scale were violence. So they often categorized them as aggression or male behaviors, but they didn't say they were violent. The gay and bisexual men's definition of violence was much more emotional, psychological. So many times in focus groups, I'm like, oh, we're men, we hit each other. It's not violent, but don't call me fat. It's a classic one. Or don't stop me seeing my friends. Or don't try and out me. Things that were psychological or emotional were much more pervasive and potent. And so when we did the survey that this led to, we used the new items generated from the focus groups as our new scale. So this is the theory that we were trying to test, the theory of minority stress, developed by Alan Meyer, who's now at UCLA School of Law. For those of you who don't know it, we're really looking at these outcomes. So we were looking at intimate partner violence, HIV, sexual risk-taking as our outcomes. And we're interested in two sets of proximal and distal factors. So it's really, the theory is that negative health behaviors among sexual minorities are the product of external and internal stressors that lead to vulnerability in their relationships, and these stresses manifest themselves as negative health behaviors. So in terms of internal, we have economic hardship, minority identity, and internalized homophobia. These are essentially struggles with your own identity, be it your racial identity, your ethnic identity. We are more interested in how struggles with your own sexual identity shape your tolerance of IPV in a relationship, whether the extent to which this manifests itself as violence against other people, whether does it reduce your feelings of self-esteem and self-efficacy and lead you to take more sexual risks. And then for external stressors, we collected data on racism, homophobia, and the extent of community support. So you can be have a strong gay identity, but you're living in Georgia, but you're living in an area of high homophobia, and what does that do? And equally, what happens if you have both? If you experience the dual effects of racism, homophobia, and you're struggling with your own identity? What does that do for your coping mechanism? What does it do for your social network? How does that manifest itself in negative behaviors? So Project Lust, we had 18 months to recruit, and we finished in 8 weeks, because I have the best project director ever. She's going to take over the world one day. So she can attract gays like nobody else. Essentially, she emits a pheromone or something, and she managed to find 1,100 in a venue-based sample in the space of 8 weeks. It's incredible, with 99% data completeness. We used a venue-based recruitment strategy. Do people know VBS, not Vacation Bible School? Sorry, I'm telling from Georgia. Yeah. So venue-based, it's when you don't have a sampling frame. We don't have a list of all the gay and bisexual men in Atlanta, but we can proxy this by a list of places that we know we can find them. So I have currently 16 other projects that work with MSM and gay and bisexual men on the go. And over the course of the years, we've built up a list of, I think it's 120 venues in Atlanta where you find gay and bisexual men. These are clubs, bars, nightclubs, sex clubs, parks, coffee shops, stores, gyms, all kinds of places. We also recruited from, Atlanta has two prides. It has Atlanta Pride and In the Life Pride, sometimes known as Black Pride. So two separate pride. Well, they're not separate prides, we just have two versions of Pride. Aid Atlanta is a local HIV testing organization, so we recruited from there. And then we recruited from a whole list of venues. And the way we did this, to make it, it sounds like we're hanging out on street corners. It's a little more scientific than that. So we have a list of all these places throughout Atlanta that we know we can find gay and bisexual men. For every one, we know the approximate volume at times of the day. And we've collected this over the years. Every 6 months, we update this sampling frame and update this volume data. So we know for the red star, the most popular times are Mondays, Tuesdays at these times. That, you know, the blue star, so this is clearly, you know, a club. Actually, where is this? I actually know what that is. So we know for all 120, for every day of the week and for every 4-hour block, the approximate number of people you would find in that venue. And then we do simple, randomly select time, space, sectors to sample from. So it does have an element of, you know, it's a random sample. So each week, Kate, our program director, would generate that week's list. Say, okay, Monday between 2 to 6, you're going here. Friday here, Wednesday here. Working in pairs of in twos with a pink t-shirt with Project Lust on. They would stand at the venue and imagine a square, and every fourth person who walked through the square they would approach to see if they wanted to take the survey. That's venue-based sampling. There's some interesting papers. Jose Baumeister, who's at University of Michigan, and is one of my favorite names to say. He's done some interesting work that shows that you get very similar sample characteristics than with random digit dialing, which was really the only alternative. So we ended up in places like Bulldogs, which is a nightclub, Lake, which is a nightclub, sex clubs, bars, parks, all kinds of places where I get to. So if you work for me, this is where you will be going. And so these are our Project Lust teams at the two Pride events. This is a cheap and effective way to get, you know, these $80 cutouts attract. We had lines of people waiting to have their photograph taken with them, and then it's like fish in a barrel. You know, it's easy. Just with your iPad. All our surveys are iPad, so they fill them in on that touch screen on the iPad. The data goes straight to the survey gizmo. There's no data cleaning. We have MiFi systems. So yeah, this is our Black Pride. We averaged 400 a day, 400 over a 3-day period at each Pride. You know, and our incentive is a $30 Target gift card. That's all. So.
And a picture with the cutout.
And a picture with a cutout. What more could you want? So we would approach people and we'd say, so we approach people with an iPod Touch, and we ask them basic questions: eligibility, age, race, sexual identity, live in the Atlanta metro area. We show them the screen and they touch the screen so that they don't have to tell us the answer. We turn the screen, it tells us if they're eligible, and we know that we can continue. So we approach them, show them the iPod Touch, and if they're not eligible, we give them condoms and lube and send them on the way. If they are eligible, we ask them to take the screener. There's some further screening questions about being in a relationship. If they're ineligible, they go get condoms and lube. If they are eligible, they have two options. We say, okay, you're eligible for the survey. They can either say no. Very few, less than 1% ever said no. You can do it now, or you can go home and do it. If you do it now, we have a little fold-out table. You sit down with the iPad and you fill in the survey. It takes 20 minutes. So you do it on the iPad, and you get your gift card. If you do it later, we give you an ID card. You go home, you do it, and we send you electronically the Target gift card. So we generated cards that look like this. So everyone has a unique ID. So it's restricted per IP address. So
how did you disqualify people that ineligibility were that they didn't meet your criteria?
Eligibility had to be in a relationship for at least 6 months, and they had to have had sex in the last 6 months.
Okay.
And you can't ask them that in the first
Of
question.
course not.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, some people try. No, I just say. So we established.
I wanted to find out what you were using
Yeah.
for your screening allocation, because then we could see of those who say no,
Yeah,
we could also figure out what their selection regime is of participants, non-participants.
and we can. Yeah, we can do that. Exactly.
What you're screening them initially.
So initially we ask on, age, race, where you live, and sexual identity, and then the next set, if the past there, is relationship and sex in the last 6 months.
So you would know for all of them what your selection regime is.
Completely. Yeah. And we have it all electronically. We don't have to calculate it. It's easy. So for those who say, I really don't want to fill this in outside the gym, I want to go home, they get a card. It's restricted to only one pair IP address. This code only works once. They complete the survey. And we had 100% uptake when we gave these people who got to the stage where they got the card, went home, 100% of them did it. And I know, who knew that a $30 Target gift card was the answer to everything? But it worked. So looking at our sample characteristics, I'm going to stand around here if that's possible. We have around, fairly even age distribution. We have around 42% Black, non-Hispanic. We have a self-reported 25 to 6 HIV prevalence, which is slightly the Atlanta prevalence is 22%, so it's slightly higher. We over-sampled those with a college education and those who are employed, and 90% of our samples self-identified as gay, homosexual, only 10% bisexual. Looking at the reporting of the different external stressors, so this is homophobic discrimination. It's a scale validated by Diaz for use in the US. Interesting here that, sorry, I will get used to this clicker soon, 96.9% reported any form of homophobic discrimination over their lifetimes. This is not recent. The most common ones were due to your sexual orientation, were you ever made fun of as a child? Have you ever been made fun of as an adult? Did you ever hear, as a child, do you ever hear that gays are not normal? Have you ever pretended to be straight? It was 85%, which is really high. So very high, and these did vary by race. So very high levels of actual experiences of homophobia. These are not perceived discrimination. Looking at experience of racism around, and we asked these of all races as well. So around 70% reported lifetime experience of racism. The most common being, I've been rejected for sex, which I think is really interesting. There are strong racial tensions even within the gay community in Atlanta. I think this is indicative of that. Ever been treated rudely or unfairly? The ones that were less common were the ones that are the more extreme violence. Do I want to say that's more extreme? No. The ones that are actually physical violence. All of these are extreme. The internalized homophobia is a measure of the extent to which you're struggling with your own identity. It's Brady and Boos, 1994. I can send the paper around if anybody wants to read it. It's a scale that ends up with a score of 0 to 80. And those who are on that, and it's put into quintiles, those on the highest end have the strongest, categorized as being most proud, strongest gay identities. So it includes items such as, I doubt that I'm a homosexual, but I'm still confused about who I am sexually. I may be homosexual, but I'm upset about the thought of it. I tolerate rather than accept my homosexual thoughts and feelings. Just to show you what this looked like, of the variations. Look at homophobic discrimination. We can see external homophobia was more commonly reported by white participants. Racist discrimination was more commonly reported by black participants. And it's internalized homophobia. Look at this. This is this difference. Our black participants had much more struggles with internal identity than external stressors. And the reverse was true for our white participants. Very interesting. So looking at what was associated with the reporting of homophobia, those who were of self-reported black race had lower reporting of external homophobia. Those with a positive HIV status much more likely to report homophobia. Again, it's cross-sectional data. but it really does speak to the intersection between sexual risk and stress. EPV and PPV, those who've experienced physical violence from a partner, or those who've perpetrated physical violence recently against a partner, much more likely, by far, this dominated the model, were much more likely to report homophobia. Strong link between experiencing external stress and then this manifesting itself as violence in your relationship. Which, I mean, if you draw parallels to the literature on women's violence, that, you know, these external that economic stress or jealousy and power dynamics are strong correlates of violence in heterosexual relationships. Similarly, you see that in the same way, but a different set of stresses also shape violence among these same-sex relationships. What was correlated with internalized homophobia? Black race. You know, our black participants much more likely to report these very negative internalized struggles with their own sexual identity. Those who, being in a partnership, actually currently having a main partner was protective. Which could be a reporting issue. If I'm willing to report that I'm in a relationship with another man, then maybe I don't have such a problem with my own identity. And those who perpetrate sexual violence are much more likely to struggle with their own identity as well. So looking at the minority stress, we modeled, sorry, I'm going to have to go to clicker 101 when I get back. So we modeled these as our outcomes, and these are different I'll explain how we get to these later, but these are different forms of violence. So those who experienced monitoring violence were more likely to also report homophobic discrimination. I won't go through all of these, but they're all in a positive direction. And the takeaway message here is the more external stressors that a same-sex couple, somebody who's in a same-sex relationship, a same-sex male relationship, experiences, the more likely they are to both receive violence and perpetrate violence within that relationship. So remember earlier I said I was kind of worried that we were using the conflict tactic scale to measure violence among gay men, because it's a very heterosexual definition of violence. So we used it in our focus groups. We asked what is violence. We generated 30 items. In the survey we included our new 30 items, the conflict tactic scale, and the CDC measures of violence. So all three were in there. Interesting that this is the conflict tactic scale that includes calling you fat, ugly, accused you of being a lousy lover, destroyed something, threatened to hit you, threw something at you, pushed you, punched you, slammed you, beat you up, kicked you, or used threats to make you have sex. That's the standard conflict tactic scale that we use in almost all violence studies. Our focus group, we're calling the IPV-GBM, that's gay bisexual men scale, generated this list, and you'll see that what's in yellow is the same. But there was a lot of new things that were really specific to sexual identity, such as lying about your HIV status, not telling you had HIV, intentionally transmitting HIV to you, a lot of HIV-related violence. This is really difficult to message, because the potential for further stigmatizing HIV positives is really difficult here, so we're really careful how we message this. A lot of social network and stalking behaviors, constantly reading your email, posting on, constantly liking your things on Facebook. I'm sure that's not violence. Calling you fat, criticizing your clothes, and getting you to act straight. Were much more, and there's strong racial variations as well. The ones that were much more psychological were by far more likely to be reported by our African American participants. White gay men's definition of violence was the same as heterosexual women's. African American gay men's definition of violence was much more psychological. It's really interesting how varied it was. So we did some fancy factor analysis, and they actually, several things drop out, and we end up with a list of 23 items, and they hang very nicely into 5 domains of violence. There's physical and sexual violence, which all measures of violence include. This is slapping you, punching you, forcing you to have sex. There's monitoring behaviors, demanding access to your email, reading your email, stopping you seeing your friend, reading your text messages. There's controlling, which is stopping you from seeing your friends. For me, this is the most exciting, sounds terrible, but the most, the newest is the HIV-related violence. And it really fell down to lying about his HIV status, not telling you you had HIV before you had sex, and intentionally transmitting HIV to you. And then emotional. And so we have so this is our new scale with a great Chromac alpha score. Well, we found out this morning, it's coming out in +1 soon. But it's interesting how none of the other measures of violence are significantly related to sexual health outcomes, but this has a very strong correlation to sexual risk among our sample. I'm also working with, I forgot his name, Theo Sanford at Columbia University, and this scale will be validated on a New York sample and also the Amsterdam men's cohort study as well. So trying to validate this in more situations. So just to further push this home, this is the experience. This is the experience of violence reported by our sample. Remember, we asked everybody all 3 sets of questions using the standard CDC questions. Standard CDC questions are just 2. Has anyone hit, slapped, punched, kicked, or slammed you against a wall? And has anyone forced you to have sex? It's 2 simple questions. This is the CTS I already described. So the CTS does better than the very basic CDC questions. This is ours. We detect a much higher prevalence of violence. We ask more questions. Duh. Of course we detect a higher prevalence. The counter-argument to this is, if I ask these same questions of heterosexual women, would I also get a higher prevalence? Because I'm asking about more types of behavior. I don't know yet. I will find some heterosexual women and we shall ask them. So that's my next task, to find out where they hang out during the day. I don't know. I'll find them. But it is something that I'm very cognizant when I present this. Like, this is a much more refined measure of violence. Is it necessarily specific just to gay and bisexual men? Elements of it are, I think. But we need to test this a little bit further. So it's interesting how, just look at the variation in prevalence you get from it's a real measurement issue, this as well, how we define violence. Perpetration is equally as interesting. Look how much more perpetration we get as well, particularly among, Caucasians. Look at this, from 4.8% to 28%, the same sample, with different measures of what constitutes violence. We also asked, for each of those 23 new items we generated, we asked everybody, is this violence again in the sample? And that's what we used to generate this scale. Our new scale is strongly linked to negative sexual behaviors as well. And this is using our new scale, a very crude measure of did they experience any of that, so whether the victim of any of those 5 forms of violence in the last 6 months and how it linked to sexual risk-taking. No, it's not, sorry, this is the other way around. This is the number of anal sex partners. Sorry, So if they received any violence, if they reported HIV-related violence, a much higher number of we couldn't get unprotected versus protected. Our question didn't work. So this is just the number of anal sex partners. And basically what this is saying is that the more violence you experience, the greater your sexual risk, that those who experience, that the 2 exist synergistically. Those are in situations, cross-sectional data, those who experience violence or are in relationships that are currently characterized by violence are also having a lot more potential exposure to HIV as well. What are the causal pathways there? Is it self-esteem? Is it self-efficacy? Is it ability to negotiate condom use? Is it looking for alternative pathways out of the current relationship? What are the pathways here? It's really interesting. Because we know for heterosexual men who perpetrate violence have more sex partners as well. So it's interesting for that gay men, we find those experience violence also have more sex partners. Interesting results with condom negotiation. This is just looking at whether your report felt unsure or unable to negotiate condom use with your most recent male anal sex partner, very specific. And we find there are links, but it's not just the physical, Overall, the scale, 11% increase in thinking that you can't negotiate condom use with your current partner. But, though those who feel physical sexual threats, those who feel controlled, those who feel a sense of emotional violence, but interestingly not HIV-related violence. So there's something, and it's again, you can draw parallels to the women's literature, the work of Jackie Campbell that shows women in violent relationships are less likely to be able to use condoms because they either have no control over the sex when the sex happens, the power dynamic disables them from arguing for condom use, or there's just no access to condoms. And it's the same, parallels here, that men in these violent relationships may be just not able to negotiate condom use. And that's a real area of HIV prevention I don't think we've really focused on. If you look at the majority of HIV prevention messages, they put the actor as being in control constantly, like you should use condoms, you should do this. Well, what if it's not always your decision? In my spare time, I'm an HIV counselor and tester, and I ask my clients, about experiencing violence in their relationships, and a lot report. It's even hard to get when I train other counselors to ask those questions, because it's like, oh well, men don't experience violence. That's a women's issue. And it's really hard to message this, how do you work around this? So we've also found that minority stress was reported with sexual risk-taking. It wasn't just violence was associated with sexual risk-taking. So again, this is looking at, there was a link between experiencing racism, I know I put a whole bunch of stuff on one graph and I shouldn't do that, experiencing racism and the number of anal sex partners. Experiencing homophobic discrimination was linked with having sex while highs on drugs or buzzed on alcohol in the last few months. So it's internalized homophobia. Again, it kind of makes sense. If you're in a situation where you're constantly being told you're wrong, where you're facing discrimination, or even if it's not outward negative discrimination, it's heteronormativity, where everything around you is just geared towards a heterosexual couple, that places an internal stress on you. And that internal stress can manifest itself as, drug use, as alcohol use, as, you can use discount theory to talk about why this happens, I'll accept the consequences later. I have very little self-efficacy or self-esteem. And, we know that there's incredibly pervasive drug problem among the gay community in the US with the use of meth. And, we tackle it, again, the same way that we tackle HIV by putting the onus of control on the individual, maybe by making structural changes, marriage equality, I wrote an op-ed recently, something as simple as marriage equality could shape these things, by marriage equality is not just a human, I'm going to go preach, it's not just it's not a human rights issue, it's a health issue, by changing structures, allowing people to marry, showing greater tolerance and acceptability for different forms of relationship, you can reduce stress. Reduce stress, you improve health. So, I'm going to finish really early. Minority stress is concentrated among vulnerable. We know that, and I didn't show you these results, those with lowest levels of education, those currently unemployed, those from racial minorities were much more likely to report minority stress. Those who don't have the social capital are most likely to experience these negative stressors. Interestingly, and how much our HIV positive, and we had 25%, reported very high levels of stress. Not just associated with being positive, but external stress. Our black HIV positive participants reported a lot more racism, a lot more homophobia, and they're so reducing those are pathways to reducing HIV. We see here that there's a strong link between experiencing stress and negative outcomes, which makes sense when you say it like that. But I don't think we've really tackled it for sexual minority populations. And I think the ultimate expression of these stresses is through risk-taking and through aggression, which can explain the very high levels of violence we're seeing in these relationships and the very high levels of negative risk-taking behavior. So just returning to our theory, we looked over here at these outcomes. This was only in R21. I know, I did this on R21. That we didn't test for HIV. I'm in the process of writing this as an R01 national list to do this in 6 cities across the US with a larger sample to actually increase, to have mental health outcomes. My regrets are we didn't include mental health and we didn't actually test for HIV. So next time we'll actually test for HIV and we'll actually include mental health. We need to include those. We didn't have very good measures of economic hardship as well, which we should do. We really focused on the external stresses that were linked to race and identity. It's interesting, and I didn't really get into this. We also collected a whole other set of network data where we asked our participants to list all the people they talked to in a month. Then we collected their characteristics, their age, their race, perceived sexual identity, whether they were in a relationship, strong network effects, you know. If you're in, the best thing to be in is if your friends are other gay people who are in couples, it's strongly protective of your health. If you're friends with a lot of gay single people, it's bad for your health. It's really interesting. And is it role modeling? You know, if your friends are a lot of gay couples, do you say, oh, you know, this is normal, there are relationships, you know, provides role models that we don't see elsewhere. The worst thing the worst thing is to be in a network that's made up of older single men. That's the worst thing for health. I still don't know why. If you're a young guy who hangs around with a lot of old guys, run away, because it's bad for you, really bad for your health on every outcome. So, and we're still struggling with that one. So we have some pretty good network data as well. But the network data also speaks to the access to social capital. You know, at the other end of the scale, the other guys who did well were who did poorly, the ones whose networks had nobody who they thought was gay in it. You know, where are the links to the gay community? Where are there links to, you know, services to test in? It's interesting. So some of the intervention points, we are developing several interventions. Being in the School of Public Health, I place a strong emphasis on, you know, not just writing this up, but also actually developing, you know, looking at modifiable change and developing programs. As I said, the progress towards equality is more than a human rights issue. You know, legalizing same-sex marriage has health implications, you know, and I think that's something that we need to start messaging more. Subtly, it's not just discrimination, it's heteronormativity that can shape health. Just not having services available for same-sex couples, you know, and that's not for an outward malice, it's just people never thought that they needed them. And just making, you know, subtle shifts around heteronormativity can have a strong impact as well. Role identity formation, particularly for our racial and ethnic minority participants, was a real issue. You know, sex ed in the US is geographically varied and hilarious in some places. But it speaks for me to the role for sex positive and identity discussions in sex education. You know, being able to talk about sexual identity formation at an early age can combat some of these issues. So the intervention I'm working on at the moment is a text message-based intervention around the hotspots around violence. So trying to, you know, increase people's own understanding of what their triggers are for violence, and have text messages that I haven't thought it through, 'cause I'm still writing it, that are actually text messages that speak to their own individualized triggers and to try and reduce violence within relationships. And then we're just finished an actual scale, you know, to measure violence. So we have the SAFE tool. Whenever you go to an ER, if you're a woman, they go to the SAFE tool to check to see what extent to which you're a risk for violence. We developed the one for gay bisexual men that's based on these 5 domains of violence. It's just 5 questions that a practitioner can ask. and they can identify if that man's at risk of violence. And so we're trying to roll that out. We're working with several agencies, including Fenway Health in Boston, to try and to get that actually out there into practice and increase understanding of what violence is, and that it's actually a problem for men too. And that's it. I managed to get through it all. So you're the first people to hear these results. So there you go. Thank you.